The principles of Jiu-Jitsu can be applied to every endeavor in life. You have to stay calm when you're in bad situations. You need to cover and conceal your intent with other maneuvers. You need to utilize the simplest and most efficient methods. You need to prioritize your focus of effort. You need to train until you trust yourself to move intuitively without having to think. You need to move at the right time. You have to defend critical areas. You should not attack your enemy's strong points. You must use leverage. You cannot let your emotions drive your decisions. You have to establish a good base foundation to build upon. You cannot be overly aggressive, but you can't just allow things to happen. When you make a move, you have to believe in what you're doing. You have to be mentally strong. You have to keep an open mind. You have to continually learn new techniques while always reinforcing the fundamentals. You have to adapt your plan if circumstances change. The list goes on and on and on. And this is an excerpt from the book we're going to talk about today, Breathe, A Life in Flow by Rickson Gracie with Peter McGuire.
Welcome to Performers, the podcast that takes you inside the minds of the world's most extraordinary athletes, coaches, and performers. We're your hosts. I'm Dr. Duncan Simpson, and you've just heard from Dr. Greg Young. As sports psychology experts, we'll guide you through the pages of their autobiographies, revealing the mindsets, strategies, and habits that propel the world's best to the pinnacle of their fields. Each episode represents over 20 hours of our expert analysis, condensing entire autobiographies into concentrated insights. You gain not only the collective wisdom of these elite performers, but also access to over 30 years of our professional expertise in sports psychology. Listening to this, you are saving countless hours while accessing the distilled wisdom and proven strategies of the best in their field. On Performers, we help you connect life-changing lessons with your personal and professional goals, offering you an accelerated path to personal excellence. Greg, what are the listeners going to get out of this episode?
Well, in this episode of Performers, you will, number one, learn that an R is apparently pronounced as an H in Brazilian Portuguese. So while it's written as Rickson, apparently it's pronounced Rickson. So I'm going to do my best to get through this without messing it up too many times. Number two, you'll discover how Rickson Gracie's calmness under pressure can help you navigate through life's toughest moments and make effective decisions. Number three, gain insights into how relentless practice and lifelong learning were key to Rickson Gracie's success, helping you trust your training and move intuitively. And number four, learn how integrating physical, mental, and spiritual practices can lead to holistic well-being and peak performance, inspired by Rickson Gracie's journey. So just to paint a picture, give you a little bit of insight about Rickson. He's a 9th degree red belt Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu martial artist, the highest rank awarded to any current living practitioner. So to give you context, in order to obtain a red belt, you must have had your black belt for 45 years and be considered a grandmaster of the art. He's a multiple-time Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu world champion, inducted into the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Hall of Fame, undefeated in mixed martial arts at 11-0, competed in Vale Tudo, which we'll talk a little bit about later, in Japan, winning the tournament in 1994 and 1995. His official record stands at 11-0, but his unofficial record gives him an undefeated record of 465-0. Gracie focused all of his energy on spreading the art of Jiu-Jitsu. His technique is considered to be the finest expression of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu in the world. Rickson Gracie is widely regarded as one of the greatest Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioners and a key figure in the development and promotion of the martial art globally.
Well, 465-0, that's some record.
Just a couple more than yours, right?
Yeah, just a few more.
Just a few more, unofficially. So let's dive into his family life. I come from a long line of proud and pugnacious people that I can trace back to Scotland, home of one of the world's great warrior cultures. The Romans invaded Scotland several times in the first 3 centuries AD, but the fiercely independent clans fought back with a fury that impressed even the mighty legions. When there were no Romans or British left to fight, the clans fought each other. The leaders were willing to lead from the front and die in the face of overwhelming odds and certain defeat. Even though I grew up a century later and a continent away, these were values not too different from the ones that my family lived by and tried to pass on to me, my brothers, and my cousins. Like our Scottish ancestors, it was only through fighting that one became a respected member of the Gracie clan. If one fought especially well, as I did, you became a favourite son, and after your martial arts odyssey, a respected leader. So Duncan, it sounds very much like he considers fighting to be a central tenet to being a Gracie, almost like it's in the blood. Other than previous performers talking about specific and usually immediate family members, I'm not sure we could say that about any other performers so far, that they consider what they do to be part of their ancestral heritage.
You're right. Not necessarily ancestral heritage per se, but I think we talked about in episode 4 the power of cultural heritage with Dan Carter playing for New Zealand All Blacks. And in episode 10 with Pele, we talked about him and representing Brazil in soccer and how both those countries, sport is just so woven into the culture of those nations. It's not necessarily ancestral ties, but there's definitely cultural links to those sports in those countries, I'd say, Greg.
The Brazilian side of the Gracie family was also full of bold and dynamic people. My great-great-grandfather, George, left Dumfries and arrived in Rio de Janeiro in 1926. Initially, he worked in the import-export business, but married into an upper-class Brazilian family and became director of a bank in Brazil. His son, my great-grandfather, Pedro, also became a prominent banker. Duncan, it sounds like he's from a family of go-getters, people that take initiative and look to really sort of better their circumstances. Are we seeing a pattern emerge here with other previous episodes?
Undoubtedly, our environment shapes us and we learn lessons passed down through our generations. The Gracies obviously exemplify that idea that success comes from the willingness to take risks, embracing new opportunities, it sounds like, and ultimately pushing outside the comfort zone, traveling to new countries, and looking to explore what's the best life can give them. I think these traits are not just confined to this family, but these are universal traits. If you take that idea of taking risks, exploring new opportunities, and pushing outside your comfort zone, that can be applied to anybody who's seeking greatness.
In 1917, my grandfather Gastão Gracie took his 15-year-old son Carlos to watch a Vale Tudo fight in Bellem's Teatro de Paz. After Carlos watched the 5'4", 145-pound Japanese man control and dominate much larger opponents, he had a revelation. A fighter who used technique, strategy, and intelligence could defeat a fighter who only had size and strength. So Duncan, for a little bit of context here, Vale Tudo fights are no holds barred. Literally anything goes. That's what Vale Tudo means. So this revelation sparked essentially the Gracie revolution in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which of course we'll come to, but it's interesting to see the seeds of these things start to develop.
Yeah, it sounds like one simple idea, that idea of a smaller opponent utilizing probably more strategy and more skill and more intuition to outfox a larger opponent. That may play a larger theme in really revolutionizing the fight game. I think in many ways there's a lot broader lessons that we've seen within this podcast. That idea that success can be a combination of intelligence and maybe strategy and adaptability rather than just relying on raw power or talent. It's a combination of skills. And that's a timeless lesson that can be applied across many of our performers, to be honest.
So his dad, Helio, plays a massive role in his life and indeed in the Gracie family. A very interesting cat, to say the least. So we'll learn a little bit about him here. My father was far from the best athlete in the family. When he was a child, a doctor told him not to exercise because of his vertigo. My dad used to say, I was born weak, I'll die weak. I'll pass for strong because of jiu-jitsu. Because Helio did not have the option of using power, he had to rely on leverage, sensitivity, and timing to compensate for his lack of strength. I know this might sound like an exaggeration, but Helio Gracie was to jiu-jitsu what Albert Einstein was to physics. He greatly improved the martial art by further developing a position called the guard that was both defensive and offensive, which allowed him to fight off his back with his opponent between his legs. Not only was he able to defend himself from punches, but he could also control and submit his opponents with an arsenal of chokes and joint locks. Slight and physically unimposing, Helio Gracie was a perfect poster child for a martial art that claimed to be the triumph of intelligence over brute strength. Duncan, they say that necessity is the mother of invention. Here we see Helio create elements of the art that addresses his physical limitations. Have we seen this in anyone else yet?
In our first episode, we talked about Andre Agassi, and his father recognized that Andre, being 5'11", didn't have the height for a dominant serve that many of his contemporaries did. So his dad focused on developing an aggressive return game to counter those big serves. So I think that's one good example. And this adaptation not only allowed Andre to develop, certain strengths that were very different to his opponents, but it really turned a disadvantage into really a formidable weapon. And this, for me, Greg, is that powerful reminder that we can look at our limitations and find creative ways to think about how do we turn them into strengths.
That's a great example. To Carlos Gracie, jiu-jitsu was as much about psychology as it was about martial arts. He believed that because the martial art had cured his male insecurity and given him confidence and peace of mind, it could do the same for others. He used to say that he used jiu-jitsu to turn chickens into stallions. My Uncle Carlos was a very eccentric guy. He almost always wore white linen, walked around barefoot, and claimed that he had a direct, personal relationship with a benevolent spirit who gave him extra sensory perception. He often rose before dawn to meditate under the sun's first rays, and he sunbathed naked because he believed doing so would help sire strong children. My uncle talked about biorhythms, nutrition, digestion, food combining, but rarely traditional religion. He believes that the letters R, K, and C were powerful ones, which is why so many of my family's name begin with them. Carlos Gracie attracted a number of followers who shared his unique worldview. I will say that some of the practices that they have within the family are interesting and I think probably quirky to say the least, and some of the beliefs might not necessarily be to everyone's taste, but when you strip it all away, there is definitely a clear set of principles here that really powers this Gracie machine.
Quirky is a great word to use. And I love that saying, the imitating majority follow the innovating minority. And I think they were definitely in the minority. Some of their practices were a little strange. But ironically, over the years, millions and millions of people have gone on to follow Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. So they did something right.
Yeah, let's see if we can think of any people that followed this practice. When Margarita, my father's first wife, the woman I consider my mother, was unable to get pregnant, my uncle came up with a plan. My father, with my mother's knowledge and consent, would impregnate our African Brazilian babysitter, Belinha, who gave birth to me and my older brothers Horian and Helson. The whole thing was an elaborate ruse. Margarita wore a fake belly during Belinda's pregnancies, and when the time came for her to give birth, she went to the hospital and came home with a baby. Not even her best friends knew. When I was young and looked at myself in the mirror and saw my freckles, I thought they were from my Scottish blood. Little did I know I was half African Brazilian. My mother, Margarita, was a well-educated, upper-class girl whose father was a millionaire who owned a huge import-export company and lots of property. After she divorced her first husband, which was very uncommon in Brazil at that time, she fell madly in love with Helio, who was a rough guy. Not only did she polish him, she also introduced him to Rio's high society. Even though Margarita was passionately in love with him, their relationship was one-sided. Helio was ice cold and didn't care how anyone felt other than my Uncle Carlos. He was old-fashioned Brazilian macho and believed that women belonged in the nursery and the kitchen. He even went as far to say that he never loved a woman because love was a manifestation of weakness and that he only had sex for the sake of procreation. In his mind, his mission was bigger than any of these kinds of sensitivities. So Duncan, here we're getting a glimpse into his upbringing and a little bit of a look at his father, Helio, who at times during this book really does come across almost as a cult leader.
That is an absolutely wild story. We heard from Mike Tyson in episode 7 some of his background and how wild his upbringing is, but I think the Gracie family might have topped that.
He goes on to talk about his dad's parenting and teaching at the Gracie Academy. He says, "My dad was a tough and demanding teacher, but he never pushed us the way I see some parents push their kids in jiu-jitsu today. Why would a kid want to train if his dad yells at him the whole time? My father understood this and his message was always, if you win, great, but if you don't, stand up and try again. My earliest memories of jiu-jitsu are fun, even playful. My father's academy in downtown Rio took up an entire floor at a fancy office building and resembled a country club more than the jiu-jitsu academy. Each student had his own locker and received a clean gi and towel every time he trained. The initial Gracie Jiu-Jitsu curriculum consisted of 40 self-defense classes that focused on empowering students. The goal was to prepare them mentally, physically, and psychologically for a physical confrontation and to build a foundation of confidence that would give them peace of mind. Initially, we kids went to the academy just to play tug of war or have a game of soccer. We were introduced to jiu-jitsu slowly, nothing like what I see these days. Today, too many parents push their kids to compete before they're ready. For young kids, jiu-jitsu should be nothing more than a fun form of recreation that introduces them to the movements through games and structured play. As they get older, you can introduce more jiu-jitsu, but it should be playful. If you push kids too hard, too young, they'll quit forever. Parents should never burden their kids with their unfulfilled ambitions, frustrations, anxiety, or any other form of emotional baggage. The parent support must be consistent. The most important thing is that the child gets the experience. Win, lose, or draw without judgment. Duncan, there is some absolute gold here for any parents that are listening. What are your reflections having heard this?
Absolute gold. And I wrote down 5 things that I would say are quick takeaways here. So number one, the importance of having fun and being playful, especially for young kids. That can't be underestimated. That's the number one reason young people play sports, to have fun. Number two, not projecting your own unfulfilled ambitions or emotional baggage onto your kids. It's not about your legacy. It's not about what you did. It's about the kids. I loved here, Greg, the kind of the gradualism of the curriculum, introducing self-defense really slowly, focusing on building, self-confidence first and a peace of mind before really getting into more intense training. So really a gradual introduction into the sport. Number four, having a positive mindset that's been emphasized throughout, celebrating effort over results, encouraging perseverance after losses rather than criticism. So that positive mindset is fantastic. And last but not least, it sounded like they were very intentional in creating a really enjoyable environment and culture, almost like a country club rather than it being like overly serious and intense training. And I think that's so important for the youth training space.
Incredibly well stated. 5 fantastic takeaways there. Now, eventually it does get into competing and remembers the message that his father gave him before his match. Children who get involved in jiu-jitsu at a young age learn to be more than just strong and competitive. Jiu-jitsu is more fluid than judo or karate and requires patience, not just aggression, and forces students to develop strategies to find comfort in uncomfortable situations. Because I was only 6, there was no division for me, so my dad put me in a bracket with the older kids. Right before I was about to step onto the mat to fight, he said, "Rickson, if you lose the fight, I'll give you 2 gifts. If you win the fight, I'll give you 1. When I realized that my dad wouldn't be upset if I lost, the pressure melted away. I lost the match, but I didn't feel bad because my dad wasn't mad. Instead, he was proud of me for competing against the older kids. All I felt was approval. Duncan, how liberating is it to hear this kind of youth sport coaching?
I was smiling throughout when you were reading that paragraph, Greg. That kind of support really teaches kids that it's not just about the outcome. It's really about journey and personal growth. There's time to focus on the outcomes when we can get a little more serious. But it's just a powerful reminder for coaches, parents, mentors that our words and our attitudes really shape the children's experience. So we have to take that really seriously. What we say to them is really going to be ingrained. I think by removing the pressure and focusing on participation, we can help kids, develop that love of sport from an early age. When you develop the love of sport and you nurture that, ultimately that is going to help in the competitive side, and they are going to stick with the sport longer. And if they stick with the sport longer, you're going to see development and ultimately competition.
Absolutely. And we see some parallel with Messier from our previous episode where he was forced to play up there and he spoke really well about the challenges, but also the opportunity about playing up. So if you missed that previous episode, there's some absolute gold from Mark Messier about playing slightly older. Now, he begins to understand how different his family is when he heads to school for the first time, age 7. He says, "I was shocked when my mother dropped me off and I saw my classmates clinging to their mother's legs, crying and pissing their pants like babies. When the teacher asked us what we wanted to be when we grew up, other students give the usual answers. Fireman, nurse, cop, teacher. When she got to me, I said without hesitation, a fighter, a champion. I want to be just like my dad. When I went to another student's house after school and opened their refrigerator, all I saw were boxes of packaged food. I didn't even know what it was. The only things in our refrigerator were carrots, radishes, apples, and fresh squeezed juices. The only bread we ever ate was homemade wheat bread. Even at 7 years old, my worldview had already been shaped by jiu-jitsu, my family's warrior ethos, and my brothers and cousins. If Helio Gracie was the general, then my brothers and cousins were his colonels, captains, sergeants, and privates. The Gracies were a tough crowd." Sounds like they were a tough crowd. Sometimes, Duncan, we're not even aware of our own circumstances, and our reality is the only reality there is. We don't necessarily really understand our own worldview until we see a different perspective. How can listeners take this and apply this practice to their own circumstances?
It's funny how often we don't realize how unique our own upbringing or worldview is until we're exposed to something different. For me, Greg, and maybe to the audience, it's really about stepping outside of our own comfort zones and experiencing different perspectives, whether it's through meeting new people. I think traveling is a common one where you step outside, you see a different worldview, you meet different cultures, or just trying new things, exposing ourselves to different ways of thinking. For the listeners, think about areas of your life where you might be in your own bubble. Maybe it's within your job or your own social circle or even your daily routines, and challenge yourself to explore what's outside of that bubble.
I think that's some wonderful advice. And of course, being part of such a big family, he also learns from his brothers. I studied all my brothers with great interest, and when we trained, because they had different strengths and weaknesses, I wanted to know who was brave, who was scared, who would fight to the death, who was crazy, who was indecisive. Nobody impressed me more than my brother Holes. A decade older than me, he was our leader and my idol because he was an incredibly charismatic person and a natural warrior. So, due to his mother working for an airline, this enabled Holes to travel all over the world before any of us. He learned to speak English as well as Italian. Holes felt as comfortable on Park Avenue as in the jazz clubs of Harlem. My brother's open mind helped him in Jiu-Jitsu because he was willing to look outside of it for ideas when other family members were not. Holes trained and competed in Judo, wrestling, and Sambo, which he used to improve Jiu-Jitsu. Like Helio, he always wanted to win by submission, and he had an aggressive attacking style. If I disappointed Holes, there was nothing that I was not willing to do to redeem myself. Duncan, we've seen Kobe Bryant embracing tap dancing, Messier talking about figure skating. Now we've got Holes Gracie learning from other related but very distinct martial arts, judo, wrestling, and sambo. How important is it to develop this desire to learn from others and understand, as you've put it, the power of cross-pollination?
I think to start with, let's point out that Hulls was traveling a lot, and that opened up his mind, as we just kind of alluded to, a couple of minutes earlier. In layman's terms, Greg, this comes back to the word curiosity for me. And whether you're an athlete, whether you're in business or any aspect of your life, I think looking outside of your usual work environment, trying new things can lead to that growth and innovation that we're really talking about here. So challenge yourself, step outside of your comfort zone, maybe explore new disciplines, listen to podcasts that are a little bit different, or read books that you might normally not listen to, and see how you might be able to tie different lessons back to the things that you're actually passionate about. I think it's this curiosity and a blend of influences that often leads to those remarkable breakthroughs and innovations, cross-pollination of ideas, as it were. I think one very famous example of this that many of our listeners will have heard before is that of Steve Jobs, who took the calligraphy class at Reed College, which was just out of pure interest and curiosity. And while it seemed really unrelated to what Steve was actually doing at the time, he then later in life applied those skills to the influence of Apple's typography and interface aesthetics. So just taking a calligraphy class out of curiosity, really impacted, one of the biggest companies in the world down the road. You can't connect the dots until you look backwards, as Steve Jobs says, but that's innovation. That's curiosity.
After panicking during a fight with a bigger fighter, he reflected on having his brother recreate the system for him in a training session. This experience taught me an important lesson about jiu-jitsu. Sometimes it's not about escaping, but finding whatever comfort you can in hell. Something as small as turning my ribcage slightly so I can breathe a little easier can be the difference between victory and defeat. This was less a technical revelation to me than it was a mental one. So, Duncan, you may wonder why we called this episode The Family Champion. Well, here's a little bit of a reason why. Every day, however, Helio rolled a big canvas tarp out onto the lawn, and all the boys had to train. We were his chicks that he was preparing to become roosters. My cousin Carlson was the reigning family champion, but he was 17 years older than me, and the end of his fighting career was in sight. We all wondered who would be the next family champion, and the competition to see who would take his place was fierce. Helio encouraged competition amongst us and always wanted to see who stood where in the Gracie food chain. There were confrontations and tests. My dad would step onto the canvas tarp, clap his hands, and say, "Okay, Hulls, Horian, go." And without hesitation, they would step forward to spar. My dad believed that suffering was part of the growth process, and we were programmed to believe that this theory was normal. We trained so hard in the academy that tournaments seemed easy. Helio believed that the harder you trained, the easier you fought. We learned at a very young age that there was no point in chickening out because it wouldn't get you out of anything. My dad would simply say, "Get out there and do it again." You also realize that if you followed the Gracie protocols on training, diet, and fighting, they worked. Even my younger brother Hoyce, who's a very mellow guy, got pushed hard in training and understood commitment and suffering at a very young age. Duncan, you've said before to sweat in practice so we don't bleed in battle. Is that what we are seeing here?
I think absolutely we're seeing that. Wow, that's intense. There seems to be no daylight between practice and competition, to be honest, here. When you're in a competitive environment, you're constantly measuring yourself against others, which can be incredibly motivating and also forces you to recalibrate and understand your weaknesses. This kind of environment, though, obviously is not for everyone. But then again, not everyone is destined to be a champion. So, as they say, you don't win prizes in practice.
When Helio realized how good and how passionate I was about jiu-jitsu, we developed a special relationship. My dad recognized something in me and encouraged me to become the greatest Gracie. He never had to push me the way he had to push some of the others. At 13, I decided to stop going to school because it seemed pointless to me. I loved jiu-jitsu and surfing and knew that I was going to be a fighter. What did I need school for? I told my dad that I was dropping out of school, and he wisely said, "You're still my son. I will feed you, but don't bother me for anything else. No new bicycles or presents. From now on, you have to make your own money." So he did some teaching with his brother and then ventured into some criminal activities that seemed to provide more money, as criminal activities often do. But those activities obviously exposed him to the darker side of things, to drugs and to other vices, an experience which he is really thankful for having, given the opportunity to help him understand things that he was curious about and get exposed to things a little bit. He says, "While I'm not proud to expose this part of my history, I have to be honest. If I hadn't had these experiences, I would be a very different person. I made myself examine and try to understand everything that I was curious about. I sought out new and extreme experiences. I knew that I could get hurt, but I decided the risk was worth it." This seems to be something that's a useful tool for him as a fighter as well, the understanding of risk and reward. Duncan, you've used the phrase in previous episodes, "at what cost?" And we've talked about the good things that often have shadow sides, but do we sometimes forget that negative things can often have bright sides?
Absolutely. I think that's a really powerful insight, actually, and I'll get into that. I think Hickson's willingness to actually take risks and explore experiences despite those negative outcomes really highlights the important aspect of growth. We have to go through experiences, both positive and negative. And as I've said before, understanding at what cost is crucial. Drugs and other vices could have really led him down a different path. So you have to balance that. When we have a negative experience, it can show us what we don't want in life. So going into drugs, it might expose you to, okay, I definitely don't want to do that down the road. So there are positives even in some negative experiences.
As he grows more and more into the world of teaching, he says, "As I begin to understand how transformative jiu-jitsu was, I fell in love with teaching and my ability to change people and their behavior from within. It was much more than teaching jiu-jitsu. I was also adding something to someone's life. My father taught me that if you want to be a great instructor, you need to think of jiu-jitsu not as only techniques to be taught, but as a psychological education as well. In addition to fighting, students learn how to better sense danger, the difference between patience and passivity, and how losing is not the same thing as being defeated. First, you have to understand your students as people. If they're too excitable, mellow out. If they're too mellow, light a fire under their ass. If they're passive, make them more aggressive. My dad and Horian taught me how to teach the entire person, including the psyche, and not just the fighter. So here we're seeing that teaching is more than just subject knowledge. It's more than the technical. It's more than the tactical, but it's about working, as he says, with the person as a whole. When I put physical pressure on students, I see their true personalities because they immediately show me things that they are able to hide when they're not on the mat. Their state of emotional balance or ability to manage pressure, for example. Once I have this information, I use it to tailor a curriculum to the students' needs that will benefit each of them in a profound way. I don't make them examine just how they fight, but also how they feel when they fight. If students do this honestly, they don't just get better at jiu-jitsu, they rebuild themselves as stronger people. They learn how to be tougher, smarter, more resilient. Not just in a fight, but also in everyday life. So Rickson is throwing himself into his teaching, but also spends time recharging and reconnecting with a love of his, which is the beach and surfing. But that also lets him take some risks and push his limits, explore his boundaries, as it were. While doing this, he's mixing again with an interesting crowd of gangsters and drug dealers, which fortunately for him, he didn't involve himself in too much. If I were to be the greatest Gracie, I had to take risks. Even though I experimented with different drugs and potentially dangerous lifestyles, I valued my freedom above all. I never wanted to be controlled by anything, especially a drug. I also realized I had a God-given talent for jiu-jitsu, and with this came the honor and responsibility to represent my family. This always brought me back to a place of equilibrium. It was always fun to leave reality for a night, but no matter what, I was back in the academy training the next day. I never knew who might walk through the door and challenge me, and becoming the greatest Gracie was more important to me than anything else. Curiosity coupled with courage allows you to go beyond your limits, venture into the unknown and establish new limits that you never thought were possible. My curiosity always overpowered my fear, but fear was also a good friend to me. People who say that they're not afraid of anything are either crazy or stupid. Fear is a normal emotion that protects you, but sometimes you don't need protection. There are times when you have to place fear on the shelf and take action without a moment's hesitation. So he talks about one such time occurring when he's out surfing and got dragged into a riptide current. Now, fortunately, he was able to overcome this predicament, not because he was a great swimmer. He says, I was proud of myself because I'd used my brain and endurance to save my own life. Luck did not get me back to shore. I faced down primal fear and prevailed. The next day, I made myself go back to the beach, paddle out, and catch a few waves. I eventually learned that the capacity to accept anything, especially death, was the key to my physical, mental, and spiritual growth. All three of these elements must be balanced because sometimes you don't break physically, but emotionally. Sometimes you have the physicality and the emotional control, but are spiritually unprepared. Without a spiritual connection to both life and death, you can't reach the next level of performance. Soon, I would realize that if I was to dance on the razor's edge, I might fall off it and die. That was the price of admission. This is a really powerful experience for him, that getting stuck in that riptide and having to battle out. And it's clearly helped him to understand something about the nature of his performances as a fighter. Obviously, we don't want listeners to have to experience some sort of existential threat. So how might they be able to apply this lesson to their own lives?
A key takeaway, as we know, is that growth really happens on the edge of our comfort zones. When we're incredibly comfortable, growth doesn't happen. We know that physical adaptation, psychological adaptation really happens when we push the edges. So intentionally putting ourselves in challenging situations and then reflecting upon those experiences, you can develop resilience and discover what are your true capabilities. Understanding that your journey can be through discomfort and uncertainty. And when that happens, that's where really true growth occurs.
So as a fighter, he continues to go from strength to strength. With his confidence comes his ability to dominate his opponents, not only physically, but mentally. For me, jiu-jitsu needed to be more like chess, staying many moves ahead of my opponents and using my functional intelligence to take advantage of any windows of opportunity. Rarely are both fighters comfortable in a fight. Almost always one is applying pressure and one is under pressure. If you're uncomfortable, you are losing. If I'm uncomfortable, even for a few seconds, I make the necessary adjustments and get comfortable again. Once I'm comfortable, I'm your worst nightmare. I never knew exactly what an opponent was going to do, but I didn't need to. Once the engagement began, my goal was to use pain and discomfort to force an error, and then checkmate my opponent with a clean submission. Duncan, we've heard about the tactical complexities of different sports throughout the episodes. Andre Agassi sticks out in my mind for one. Can you speak to the process that Gracie's using here to maximize his performances?
I kind of identified for me in that paragraph there's three key takeaways. The first one is about anticipation and preparation. Rickson emphasized the importance of planning many moves ahead, like he talks about chess. And I think this requires not just physical training, but obviously mental preparation and the ability to anticipate your opponent's moves. So it's not about just having a plan, but also being ready to adapt in any situation. So that's number one, which is anticipation and preparation. Number two is using pressure to create opportunities. Rickson talks about using pain and discomfort to force an error from an opponent. By applying constant pressure, he's exploiting any openings and trying to capitalize on his opponent's mistakes. This strategic use of pressure is similar to how many top athletes in other sports find ways to seek opportunities in their favor. You mentioned Agassi. His game was built around putting pressure on his opponent, forcing errors. And then number three is the term I'm going to use is functional intelligence. And this is the ability to think clearly and strategically under pressure. It's about making smart decisions in real time, about using mental skills to outmaneuver an opponent. So it's the blend of physical and mental acuity that really sets great performers apart. So, Greg, in summary, it's really about blending preparation, strategic thinking, and adaptability. That's why he's such a great performer.
Three wonderful points there. So as he continues to gain notoriety, his opponents obviously become more and more challenging. So he faces a guy called King Zulu, Rei Zulu, Rei Zulu. I actually watched this fight last night on YouTube to kind of see what it was about, and it did in fact look like what he considers to be the most terrifying experience of his life. He felt initially overwhelmed and filled with doubt, but then he realized that his fear of losing was actually the thing holding him back. So with the support of his father and brother, he pushed through and discovered that managing his fear and controlling his mind were actually crucial to his success as a fighter. He says, "This fight exposed me to the most primal kind of fear that comes from within. My insecure state of mind came from the fear of losing. If you fear something that's not even happened, then quitting becomes a form of self-protection. Fear is not the enemy. It's simply a self-protection mechanism that must be managed. At the time, I was not confident enough to believe in myself unconditionally, and I was afraid of the unknown. It was a terrible feeling. Although my dad and brother pushed me through it, I reminded myself that doubts and an insecure state of mind would cripple me as a fighter. I realized that if I can control my mind, I could improve every aspect of my performance. If you have this kind of spiritual security, you realize that physicality is only one part of the puzzle. Fear is not the enemy, Duncan." Great sentence. How can listeners embrace fear as something positive in their performances?
I think back to two of our performers so far that have really handled fear incredibly well, which would be Lindsey Vonn in episode 2 and Alex Honnold, I think it was episode 11. Both of them really were masters at managing their fear. And I think because both of their sports, downhill skiing and free solo rock climbing, it's life or death situation. And to be honest, it sounds like he's really in a life or death situation here. So your question was, how do we turn it into something positive? I think fear, first of all, we got to recognize that fear is a natural response. We all have fear. It's part of the human experience. So understanding that it's part of our natural self-protection mechanism, I think that's the first key. It's instead of seeing it as something we need to avoid, it's recognizing that it's a signal that we're stepping out of our comfort zone that I mentioned earlier, and we're facing a challenge. So it doesn't necessarily mean there's something wrong, but we're just stretching our comfort zone. And this can help reframe fear as rather, well, maybe it's a sign that we're actually growing here rather than it being something we want to avoid. So the second thing is, I think fear can really sharpen our focus. Fear can heighten our senses and can actually improve focus if it doesn't overwhelm us. So when you feel fear, we can use it to concentrate more intensely on the task at hand. And this can help you stay present and make more deliberate and thoughtful decisions. So again, fear can sharpen our focus. And the last one is about transforming fear into motivation. Let fear drive you to prepare more thoroughly and push yourself harder. Knowing that fear can trigger a kind of fight or flight response, choose to channel that energy into fighting and performing at your best. It's about converting nervous energy into determination and effort. So those would be kind of my big three takeaways. It's natural, it can sharpen our focus, and we can use it to enhance our motivation.
Those are three top tips to flip your perspective on fear for sure. He says, "I've always been looking for things that could help me grow as an athlete, but now I was truly hungry for this knowledge." So we talked about Kobe Bryant, we talked about Mark Messier, how they were using tap dancing and figure skating respectively. Gracie went down a slightly less orthodox path to learn about transcendental meditation and then connecting with a guy called Orlando Canny, an accomplished swimmer, gymnast, runner, and marks who was proficient in martial arts and a winner of 2 world military pentathlons. Now, his goal was to get people to move and breathe like animals in order to rediscover their natural instincts and try and get them to move away from rational thinking and a little bit more into that intuitive thinking. So again, I think we're talking a little bit unorthodox here. Orlando liked us to try and emulate different animals because they use their strength and flexibility naturally. In a relatively short time, I was able to combine breathing with fast movement and enter into a meditative state. One day, Orlando started class and the phone rang. He had to take the call and told me to continue without him. For the first time, I was not playing follow the leader. I started to breathe and move and quickly got lost in the motion. I was jumping from ladder to ladder like a monkey. At one point, I almost felt like I could fly. All of my movements, whether standing, climbing, or on the ground, were flowing, and my transitions were seamless. I was completely unconscious. When I came back to my senses, I was on the highest rung on the ladder, dripping with sweat. I looked around and saw Orlando in the corner crying. I asked my teacher what was going on. He said, "I've nothing left to teach you." I asked him how he could say that, and he said, "I've been watching you for the last hour and 10 minutes. I called to you a few times, and you didn't hear me. You kept moving. You were in a totally meditative state. Your brain and consciousness were completely turned off." This was an emotional moment for both of us. Whenever I entered this empty mind state, I could neither hear nor talk, and I was not conscious of my movements. Not only did my mind go blank, but afterwards, I felt as if my brain had been cleaned and reset. This gave me the ability to retreat from my own consciousness and come back stronger. I noticed the effects immediately. I was able to focus with absolute clarity, and my senses grew sharper, as did my awareness of my body and surroundings. Duncan, this is clearly a very powerful moment for both him and his coach. And I know we've mentioned flow a few times in some previous episodes. Is this what's happening here? And how do you relate this experience to expertise, perhaps?
I think it's just about jumping around like a crazy monkey for an hour. Yeah, a wild paragraph, but it certainly sounds like he's in that flow state. So, listeners, stay with me here. I think what Rickson is experiencing here is he's really in that autonomous stage of learning where his actions have become automatic and effortless. In this autonomous stage, you've practiced so much that your skills have really become second nature, as it were, just automatic. This allows you to perform with what we'd say is minimal conscious thought, which is really about freeing up mental resources and thus enabling the flow state that you mentioned, Greg. In this state, as we hear from Rickson here, you're fully immersed in the activity. You lose track of time. Your movements are kind of seamless and natural. So that's really what flow is. It's about being completely immersed in that moment. And it sounds like that's absolutely his experience. And he's really entered that meditative state, and he's moving. His movements highlight expertise. His mind and body are so well trained that he can now perform really complex movement without conscious effort, really, which is, for me, it is the essence of flow.
Absolutely. To give some context there, it wasn't just one ladder. It was sort of a set of ladders on a wall that he was jumping and swinging back through. So to do that without real conscious effort is quite impressive. He says, by far the most important thing that Orlando taught me was how to control my breathing. You can go weeks without food and days without water, but 5 minutes without air and you're dead. Think about that for a moment. These breathing techniques would become especially important in the coming years because they made it much easier for me to gauge and control fear, adrenaline, panic, and claustrophobia. For example, if I wanted to control my adrenaline when I'm nervous, I breathe out at a slower pace until I get my emotions under control. If I want to increase my pace, I don't use my mind to tell my body to speed up, I just breathe deeper and faster. During high exertion, exhaling becomes more important than inhaling. To enjoy a good deep breath, you must consciously empty your lungs. When I breathe with my belly, I get more oxygen and expel more carbon dioxide. Not knowing how to breathe is like having a hand and not knowing how to use your fingers. Most people are chest breathers, meaning that their stomach does not move when they breathe because they don't use their diaphragm, only the upper part of their lungs. If you breathe from your chest, the breaths are short and panicky. Everything I've learned today was at least partially a result of breathing. My best performance, my emotional control, my ability to endure. Breathing gives me all of this. Duncan, breathing has gained massive popularity, and we're able to see athletes do this on screen a lot because we can get very, very close to them, and it's an objective thing that we can see. It's pretty explicit. And there's obviously a rise in the number of tools and the number of apps and number of books that are out there to help people to do this as well. What are the keys to help our listeners use their breath as a tool?
Great question. I think with breathing, context is key. So you have to answer the question why, when, and how are you using the breath? So just breathing for breathing's sake, obviously, we're not talking about breathing to stay alive. We're talking about intentional breath work. Why are you doing it? When are you doing it in your performance setting, and how are you going about it? There's lots of different breathing techniques. So context is king. You have to understand that. A couple of things that kind of stood out. He's really talking about diaphragmatic breathing. And as he alludes to, most people are chest breathers, as it were, which is that kind of shallow, panicky breath, which we'll have all experienced. Learning to breathe from your diaphragm, or belly breathing, which is another term that we often use, allows for those deeper and efficient breaths. So, easy for the listeners. Practice by placing your hand on your stomach and ensuring that it rises and falls with each breath. That's a very easy way to practice diaphragmatic breathing. The other part of breathing is controlling the pace. So using your breath to manage your emotions and physical state. If you're nervous or anxious, slow your breathing down to calm your body. Conversely, if actually you need to ramp up and have a bit more energy, breathe a little bit faster. So controlling your pace with intention. And the last one is really focusing on exhalation. So during high exertion, exhaling fully is critical. Make sure you empty your lungs as completely as possible to enjoy that kind of full deep breath. And this helps maintain steady flow of oxygen and efficient expulsion of carbon dioxide. So those three things: diaphragmatic breathing, control your pace, but then also really focus on the exhalation. And that's a kind of three easy takeaways for the listeners, Greg.
I really like that. And of course, breathing is something that everyone is doing all of the time. I think really what Gracie's talking about here, and the key points that you've just outlined there, first of all, you said context is king, but also it's just breathing with intention. It's taking something that we do all of the time and having a real clear understanding of what it is we're actually trying to get out of it and applying those three great tips. He says, Orlando taught me how to empty my mind and use my intuition instead of my brain. This gave me a huge advantage in the ring. When I fought, I was neither emotional nor intellectual. I never thought about strategy. I just allowed myself to connect with my opponent on a profound level. The moment the bell rang, I didn't expect anything or plan anything. In order to do this, I had to rid myself of all thoughts about victory or defeat. Anything I didn't need for that specific fight against that specific opponent went on the shelf. So it sounds very much like he's getting himself into a state of mind so he can just trust his training and do what he's good at, Duncan. I like the maxim, we don't rise to the occasion, we fall to our level of training. And I think I've probably stolen that. It's a military term, I think. But trusting that training seems paramount here.
I think trusting your training, Greg, is absolutely crucial because it ensures that when you're under pressure, your body and mind know what to do instinctively. We know under pressure, we just don't make good decisions most of the time. So if we can trust our training, we can do things instinctively. We hear from Rickson, his approach is about kind of shelving unnecessary thoughts and focusing purely on that moment. He's really immersed in the situation, and then he can fully rely on years and years of extensive training that he's undergone. This way he can perform without hesitation, without distraction. He's showcasing a really true depth of his preparation and skill, and he's really very much in the moment. So listeners, how can you apply these lessons? Think about any high pressure situation. It's not about trying to do something extraordinary under high pressure. It's really about falling back to that solid foundation of training and preparation.
That's wonderful. Extraordinary is a great word. People think you've got to do something kind of spectacular when really it's about doing the ordinary things extra well. So he has a second fight against King Zulu or Rei Zulu. And he's obviously learned from their last encounter. He says, in our first fight, King Zulu was reckless because he didn't fear or respect me. In our second fight, he was much more careful and did not charge at me when the bell rang. When we finally connected in a clinch, he picked me up and slammed me, but I wound up on my guard. Thanks to Orlando, mentally, I was a different fighter now. In this fight, I was confident and prepared, and my body was on autopilot. At a certain point, a fight becomes a transcendental experience. It was as if I was in the wheelhouse of a ship at sea, looking out of a porthole at the chaos of a stormy sea all around me. I'd been here before, and my body needed no instructions. Even with King Zulu inside my guard trying to headbutt me and gouge my eyes, I was totally calm. I stayed on my back, made sure to control his head, and heel kicked him over and over again in the kidneys and the floating ribs. What would have stressed me before I trained with Orlando was now child's play. My potential was not growing a little bit, it was growing by leaps and bounds. I now felt as though I had a reserve parachute that nobody else had, and I was ready for anything. Duncan, sometimes it takes one perhaps simple yet key element to really unlock an athlete's potential, and it seems like the stuff he's been doing with Orlando, the breathing, is just that thing for Rickson.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds in this paragraph, he is someone in absolute control of his art and his craft. He is in complete serenity. He's calm when a guy gouges his eyes out, which is incredible. So going back to the breathing, I've used this before, but really simplicity is complexity resolved. So make no mistake, Greg and listeners, there is a lot going on in a fight, as you can hear, but he's able to just center and he's able to remain calm. And how does he do that? Well, breathing is the key. He talks about Orlando and how Orlando has shaped his mindset. So just being able to breathe and have serenity in the middle of absolute chaos, it's incredible, but that's why he was the greatest ever.
I also watched this fight and saw some of the heel kicks to the kidney he was putting in there. It was, those probably had something to do with it as well. I don't think it was all breathing, but maybe breathing unlocked that.
We can probably put some links in the show notes if anyone's interested in seeing a couple of these fights with King Zulu. I thought that was your nickname, but there you go.
He continues to fight in Brazil and takes on essentially all comers, including an intense fight with a rival academy. And naturally, he won because of his unofficial record. Feeling like he'd achieved all that he could do in Brazil, he decides to move to the US to open an academy, as he essentially saw it as a bigger stage with more opportunity for him and his family and to develop a better future. And all he had to do was teach and train. And his brother Horian, who spoke English, would basically take care of everything else. During this time, they're spreading the Gracie Jiu-Jitsu gospel and even converting other fighters from other disciplines into students, including famous figures like, get this, Chuck Norris. I definitely didn't know that about Chuck Norris.
Well, you probably don't know this either, Greg. Chuck Norris doesn't read books. He stares them down until he gets the information he wants.
Well, hopefully he listens to this podcast where he can just learn. He can learn from us having already read the books. There we go. Welcome aboard, Chuck. So he had a clear idea of how he wanted to run the academy, and this really shone through in his philosophy. Some teachers are only concerned with making fighters and have no regard for the other positive aspects of martial arts. My schools were never like that. I enjoyed taking guys with small bodies but big hearts and minds. Pedro Sauer, Luis Limao Herrera, my brother Hoyler, and turning them into champions. I was never impressed by someone's size or physique. I learned to judge people by their humility and their self-respect. I loved teaching jiu-jitsu because it revealed a person's true personality. When I stepped onto the mat, I saw people dressed in white, and they all had belts around their waist. Once they engaged, it was impossible to hide their nerves and their fear. Sometimes a small, soft-looking guy was the true warrior because he was resilient and brave in both victory and defeat. The coward was fine when he was kicking ass, but as soon as he got into a bad position, he would be the first to exclaim, "Stop, I'm hurt. Stop, I'm tired. Stop, I'm old." It was easy to read the mind of a coward, even if they're naturally aggressive. I tried to get my students to examine not just how they fought, but also how they felt when they fought. If they did so honestly, I could help them rebuild themselves as stronger people. However, growth only came if they were willing to face their shortcomings with pride, and only if they did their homework. But anyone who was not willing to come to the gym and continue to come back would know better than not to do their homework. There's so much here, Duncan, from a coaching perspective, but what really stands out to me is the notion of people first, athletes second. What's your take here?
If athletes know that you care about them beyond them as performers, they're going to go that extra mile for you. And I think it starts with, if they know you care, they're going to be coachable. And there's that famous line from John Wooden: they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And that's really what Rickson's saying here. He's caring about the person above and beyond the athlete.
It was also important for my students to see and know that nobody, including me, was above the fray. I never asked students to do anything that I was not prepared to do myself. If you stepped onto my mats, I was going to push you the same way I push myself. Sometimes I chose to surprise my students. After surfing, I like to show up at the morning class just before the hard rolling was about to begin. I like to shock everyone to their senses by putting them in unbearable situations that would force them to deal with the kind of fear that's normal in a fight and teach them how to manage it. As Gracies, we were taught that there's no shame in being nervous or afraid. What mattered was what you did in the face of fear. The more I knew about my students' strengths and weaknesses, the more I could teach them. It was better to learn these hard and sometimes humbling lessons behind closed doors, among friends, than out on the street. While some people are impressive natural athletes, some have a never say die attitude that cannot be taught. The latter often go further in jiu-jitsu and in life. It didn't matter to me if a student won easily or lost badly. I never focused on who won. I tried to inspire the losers as much as the winners. If a student won, I would simply say, "Props to you for winning, but you could have won smarter and faster. Anyway, congrats." If he lost, the lesson was, "Congrats, you could have made worse mistakes and you didn't panic like the last time. If you improve your arm lock defense, you won't lose to him again." I respected every one of my students for just stepping onto the mat and measuring himself against another man. Duncan, there's a maxim I think we've discussed previously. Either you win or you learn. And there's lessons here from winning and losing.
Yeah, it comes to self-reflection. There are lessons all around us. We've talked about that. And in fact, that kind of statement reminds me of the man in the arena, that quote, which I'm not going to say because I don't know it.
It's probably a good policy.
Probably a good policy. Winning and losing, of course, offers us lessons. In victory, it helps us recognize what we're good at. But also, if you're self-reflective and you're willing to look inside your performance, you can identify areas for improvement. And it's about not saying, hey, I'm great. It's about how do I constantly elevate and improve myself. On the other hand, losing provides profound learning experiences if we're willing to reflect on it. Losing teaches us, or it can teach us humility, it can teach us resilience and the importance of analyzing mistakes. We all make mistakes. And if we're going to get better, we have to analyze why did we make those mistakes and how do we improve. And Rickson's approach here about congratulating students on their effort and progress is really that kind of growth mindset research that we've heard a lot about. So to sum it up, Greg, winning validates hard work and strategy, while losing also challenges us to overcome our weaknesses and come back strong. And I think when you take that balanced perspective of winning and losing, we can learn great lessons from both.
Now, the first UFC Ultimate Fighting Championship, which was a little bit more familiar ground than some of the Vale Tudo fights we've been talking about, that occurs in 1993, and it's very different to its present iteration, much closer actually to the Vale Tudo style. And although he isn't actually fighting, he does agree to train his brother Hoyce for the competition. And during the week prior to the fights, he tells him this: winning is okay, losing is okay, and dying is okay. You should be happy to be in America representing the family. Duncan, I think I've said the same thing to you before we've played in a charity golf scramble. But he reminds Hoyce that it's all business now. He says, once we got there, I took Hoyce aside and told him that I did not want to see him laughing or joking until the tournament was over. He needed to be calm and focused. I explained, because when we walked into the cage, he would be all alone. And business it was. He won the tournament, beating 3 much bigger opponents with less than 5 minutes of total fighting time. So that's 3 fights, I think, in one day in less than 5 minutes. Overnight, the Gracie name became the biggest in martial arts. After seeing Rickson with Hoyce during the UFC, the offers started to come in from Japan, a country whose fighting traditions and culture and Bushido code he really, really admired and respected. After some negotiations, he agrees to fight in Japan under Vale Tudo rules. He takes his preparation, unsurprisingly, very seriously. I was extremely selective about who I wanted around me. My body was a well-oiled machine by that point, and I couldn't risk getting hurt. My emotional and spiritual preparation was equally important. Each day, Hoyle, Rickson, and I exercised and ate well before I went into the woods alone and got mentally prepared to go to war. I would usually take my carving tools, strip the bark off a branch, and shave it until it was clean and smooth. I liked to do things that required me to focus completely. Something as simple as cutting a piece of bamboo with a knife allowed me to keep my mind on the blade and find a rhythm. When I was finished with the stick, I would add it to the pile of wood that I would burn on my last day in camp. A couple of times a week, I would take a snorkel and submerge my entire body in a frozen river. First came the shock of the cold, followed by the searing pain and anxiety. But I got to a point where I was ready to surrender and die. If you can control your breathing, you can get past this point to where the cold disappears and the pain turns to pleasure. In order to get into water that cold, I had to control myself mentally and physically. After I emerged from the water and began to breathe, I was warm despite the freezing temperatures. I didn't even have goosebumps. So Duncan, this is him going out into the woods in Japan, and it's very secluded. It's straight out of the Rocky IV playbook, but it seems like his preparation here is really mostly centered on mentally preparing for his fight.
Absolutely. It sounds like it's straight out of the Rocky movie, to be honest, but it does highlight the need for mental preparation. Rickson's secluded training, it isn't just about physical readiness, as you say. It's about honing his mental and emotional strength. He's talking about, can he get his mind right in a frozen river? He's going to push himself to the point of kind of no return and see what's on the other side. Preparation is a very personal process, and training alone in the woods is not necessary for everybody that's listening. For some people, it's probably the wrong thing to do. So The lesson is that obviously it works for the Gracies and it's one approach. Preparation can look very different, and it's about finding what works best for you.
Throughout the tournament, he wanted to stay mentally in charge and essentially lead his opponent where he wanted him to. If you're uncomfortable, you're losing. Depending on how you struggle, I will capitalize. While I like the sniper's motto, one shot, one kill, my situation is different from the snipers because I don't have the luxury of distance. What I do is much more intimate than killing someone with a rifle from 100 yards away. I was never sure how I was going to kill, but I was always sure that I could cause the kind of discomfort that causes panic. If I'm mounted on you, you're going to feel uncomfortable immediately. If you're mounted on me, I'll never let you relax enough to feel comfortable because you'll be too busy defending my neck bridge and my elbow escape. I'll make sure that you are unstable and reacting so that my actions will dictate the terms of the fight. Duncan, this idea of one shot, one kill and being patient, waiting for your opening, is that only useful in a sport like this, or does it perhaps transcend into some others?
It's about precision, it's about patience, it's about capitalizing on the perfect moment. That concept is universally applicable. So I guess a few examples that may play in here, if you think about baseball, very experienced batters just wait for that perfect pitch. They're willing not to swing on the first 1, 2, or 3 pitches sometimes. Like, wait for that pitch. In American football, it's about the quarterback who's willing to stand in the pocket, even with 300-pound linemen bearing down on him, just to stand in the pocket and wait and wait and wait until the perfect opportunity. In tennis, it's about, hey, how do we wait for our opponent to make a mistake? How do we play a lot of neutral balls, wait for them to make a mistake, and then we can pounce on it?
Of course, he wins this tournament and in under 6 minutes of fighting time. Again, crazy. After the tournament, he returns to the US, but Japan, they're constantly trying to lure him back for more. Obviously, he's a big draw. By 1995, I was still teaching at the academy, but mostly focused on fighting and defending my title in Japan. If you're the champion and you rely only on your ability, you won't be champion for long. When a champ has only physical ability, he's incomplete. That's the difference between a champion who's stagnating and one who's dynamic. After tennis great Roger Federer lost a few matches and felt that his competition was catching up to him, he reinvented himself. He studied his swing and began to hit the ball closer to the ground. The reason race car driver Ayrton Senna was such an inspiration was that he was a champion whose mind never stopped spinning. He was never content with his performance, even when he was winning. I've been extremely competitive all my life. If I go to the pool and lose a race, I'll be back at the pool the next day and the day after that to practice. That defeat will stay in my mind until I get a chance to avenge it. The last time I lost in competition, I was a 14-year-old orange belt in a small tournament that my dad took some of the younger kids to. After I learned to empty my mind, I had the confidence to be humble, and humility played a big role in my progress. Just because I won the first Japan Open, I didn't rest on my laurels. Instead, I focused on my weaknesses, which allowed me to examine and appreciate minute details that I would have overlooked if I had no humility. In order to push myself, I needed to feel stress, disappointment, and frustration on a daily basis. It's often said that constant reinvention is the key to long-term success, and he continues to address his weaknesses in training.
There's a really valuable lesson for the listeners here, Greg. It's about constantly reinventing yourself, embracing new challenges. And with that, you have to be humble. You have to recognize that you haven't figured everything out. So humility is really at the core of this. By continuously addressing our weaknesses, I think we can push ourselves out of our comfort zones. And when we do that, we're going to stay ahead of the crowd, as it were, whether we're talking sports or business or life. And if you don't reinvent yourself, be sure that your competitors will, and they will pass you.
Those champions who say, fuck, I'm just going to keep doing what I do well, eventually falter because a natural talent can only take you so far. If you don't understand yourself, how effective can you be at anything? You also cannot become a great warrior by memorizing Sun Tzu or Miyamoto Musashi, because fighting is both an art and a science. It's artistic because it requires creativity, passion, and instinct. It's scientific because there are empirical aspects like technique, timing, strength, and endurance that also cannot be ignored. Sometimes my cornerman might tell me to move right, but I might say to myself, fuck right, I'm going left. I'm the one in the room. I can see and sense things that no one else can, and so must trust my instincts. I never thought in the ring, I felt. At the peak of my career, my senses were so finely tuned that I could smell my opponent's fear and watch him leak energy. Because of this sensitivity, I never fought blind or tried to force opportunities. Instead, I established a connection with my opponent and either waited for a mistake or solved whatever problem he presented. In either case, I was able to act or react with total commitment because my mind had been emptied of expectations, so my reactions were spontaneous. Duncan and I actually shared this paragraph with an athlete, and they said how important it was to be able to trust themselves in important moments.
It's all about what are we placing our trust in? We've talked a lot, Greg, in this episode about preparation. And if you put your trust in your preparation and you know you've done good training, then absolutely that's the thing that we should focus on, and that's the thing we should trust in. So thorough preparation allows us to then utilize, as he says, kind of instincts and then react spontaneously. So it's all about what are we putting our trust in? It's not blindly trusting that we're going to be able to perform. It's, hey, I've done all the right things leading up to it.
Now, returning to Japan, he agrees to fight with Masakatsu Funaki, who's Japan's biggest mixed martial arts star, for 1.5 million, which sounds like an absolute bargain when you think about the purses that they've got today. He says Funaki hit me with an overhand right. We wound up in the quarter, trading tit-for-tat punches and knees. 9 minutes into the fight, Funaki grabbed my neck and attempted a guillotine choke. I was able to drag him to the ground, but he hit me in the eye on the way down. By the time we landed on the canvas, I had no vision because the blow broke the orbital bones in my eye socket. My mind was still working properly, and none of my internal gauges were redlining, so I felt I could still manage the situation. If anything, I embraced this as an opportunity to show that my decades-long winning streak was not a fluke, but a result of training and methodology. I knew the only way Funaki could beat me was by knocking me out. If today was to be my last day, so be it. I would not cry, beg, or sell my soul to survive. Funaki jumped to his feet and started kicking my legs. When I made no effort to get up, the crowd realized I was hurt. The Japanese fans cheered every time he kicked my legs. Even though Hoyler was screaming, stand up, I took my time, breathed, and regrouped while everything boiled around me. I absorbed the kicks and tried not to touch my eye so that my opponent wouldn't realize how badly I was hurt. I let Funaki kick my legs, hoping that my vision would return. When it did not, I resigned myself to fighting him blind. Although he kicked me more than 30 times, he never went in for the kill when he had me in the crosshairs, and that was his mistake. Shortly after I accepted my blindness, some vision returned to one eye. I landed a kick on Funaki's knee that gave me the distance to stand up safely. I sensed that he was trying to rest, so I attacked with total commitment, and I took him back to the mat. Once I had him on his back, he did not quit despite there being no escape. Funaki was a true warrior. I punched him in the face more than 20 times before he turned his back. Even as I was choking him unconscious, he never tapped, but he went to sleep. Funaki later said that by refusing to tap, he was accepting his own death and was willing to die rather than surrender. He said that when I got him in the choke at the end of the fight, he thought he was going to die because he hadn't given his cornerman a towel to throw into the ring. The referee didn't stop me. I stopped myself. Wow. One of the things that stood out to me, Duncan, as I was reading this is that there's a training technique for pilots to learn how to fly and to land planes essentially wearing goggles that only allows them to see their instruments, so they can't see the horizon, they can't really see what's going on outside the window. But basically, they've got to trust what they're doing without sort of seeing, as it were. So Rickson's ability to fight blind here and trust his senses reminded me of that, and it just seems amazing to me.
Yeah, it's a remarkable paragraph. I love that. Great performers are great problem solvers, and he is in a real problematic state here. But he said, I'm going to stay calm, I'm going to breathe, I'm going to try and figure this out. So great performers are great problem solvers. For me, this paragraph shows that really true mastery involves more than just physical abilities. It's about mental resilience, the capacity to adapt under extreme conditions. Let's not escape that. He's broken his eye socket, he can barely see, and he's getting kicked on the floor 30 times. But by focusing on his breathing, remaining patient, trusting himself, trusting his senses, obviously he's able to navigate the fight. So for me, Greg, that this story is just a powerful reminder that sometimes we just have to rely on our training and our instincts, even when we're metaphorically or literally blind.
Rickson's life was hit with tragedy when his son Rickson passed away after a battle with drugs, and to be honest, he doesn't handle it well, and he's weeping a lot and really struggling to terms with the loss. He says, I tried to remain strong, but the truth was that the grief was much more powerful than I was. I played the role of the unflappable stoic warrior, but inside I was destroyed, yet thought I couldn't show this wound in front of my friends and family. It took a long time for me to realize how deep this pain was and that I had to surrender to it. About 3 weeks after his son's passing, the Japanese offer him $5 million to fight Sakuraba, known as the Gracie Killer, who'd already beaten Hoyle, Henzo, Ryan, and Hoyce. He accepted, but eventually walked away from the fight as he was just unable to deal with his son's death, to focus on helping his family grieve and essentially cope with the loss. I'd lived the Grayson ideology of toughness, stoicism, and grace under pressure my entire life. But after Rickson died, I didn't know if it failed me as much as I abandoned it. I could have brought all my warrior values to bear so as to stay on my feet, but my family could not. At first, I felt that I could rationalize this tragedy and move forward with my life. But then I realized that rationality cannot always suppress raw emotion. I went deep into the hole of grief, hit rock bottom, and stayed there for almost 3 years. He goes on to say, I spent a long time trying to find something positive that I could take away from this tragedy. After much meditation, I realized that I'd never really valued time. I thought that I controlled time and could put things off, like talking to my son, until later. After Rickson's departure, I understood that there is no tomorrow, because life can change forever in the blink of an eye. I needed to do my best every day. I spent 5 years rebuilding myself and my family, working through the grief of losing my son. Our recovery was more emotional and spiritual than rational or intellectual. Looking back on the experience, I can now see that a part of me died and I was reborn as a different person with a greater appreciation for how precious and fragile life is. During the years I spent grieving and rebuilding, I searched for a reason to be happy again and found 3. My children, my family, and Jiu-Jitsu. I'd been so focused on getting everyone else through this tragedy that I'd not attended to myself and had just been surviving, not living. Likewise, his wife was also just managing this crisis. Happiness is not a static thing. You have to work at it by confronting and overcoming challenges. Now, during this time, Duncan, he asks his wife for a divorce, his wife Kim, and decides to move back to Brazil and live a rather more simple life. And it should be noted, and we haven't mentioned these, there are a few infidelities throughout this story. Gone back to Brazil and basically said to Kim, here, you can have everything, leaves, starts a clean slate. And he essentially he considered opening a fish and beer shack, another academy. But he really decided that he wanted to continue to spread the kind of the Gracie gospel and conduct seminars, as that gave him a real sense of providing value to people. He said, for the first time in many years, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. And now I wanted everything in my life. A conversation with a stranger, a new project, or a jiu-jitsu seminar to have meaning. I refused to waste time on things that I did not value, and I left other people's expectations behind. Again, he highlights the importance of the philosophy that was given to him by his father. Helio believed that jiu-jitsu was much about building a student's confidence as it was about learning to fight. The frustration, injuries, and egos that today's students encounter when they attempt to learn jiu-jitsu will scare most people away. Even worse, it filters out those who need it the most, the weak and insecure. My goal today is to create a form of jiu-jitsu that will empower the entire person, both on and off the mat. If I can make a nervous person feel more relaxed than they've ever felt before, I'm changing them from within in a way that a psychiatrist or a pill never can. Today, conflict comes in many forms, and physicality is only one aspect of it. Conflict follows humans wherever they go, and people adopt different strategies to cope with it. Modern enemies can strike in a text, an email, or in a social media post. Learning to breathe, physically connect, engage, detach, and disengage, these primal processes require people to trust their senses more than their thoughts, and in doing so, reconnect them with their bodies. And on that note, Duncan, that's where we'll leave it. But, as we like to say on Performers, success leaves clues. So what are your top 10 life lessons from Breathe, A Life in Flow by Rickson Gracie?
Number 1, stay calm in adversity. Keep a clear head and a composed demeanor even in difficult situations. He said, you have to stay calm when you're in bad situations. Number 2, emphasize training and preparation. Regular practice and learning are crucial to instinctive and confident performances. He said, you need to train until you trust yourself to move intuitively without having to think. Number 3, simplicity and adaptability. Utilize straightforward methods and remain flexible in your approach. You need to utilize the simplest and most efficient methods. Number 4, control emotions. Make decisions based on logic rather than emotional impulses. You cannot let your emotions drive your decisions, he said. Number 5, establish a solid foundation. Build a strong base to support your future growth and achievements. He said, you have to establish a good base foundation to build upon. Number 6, strategic aggression. Balance assertiveness with thoughtful planning. Act decisively when necessary. You cannot be overly aggressive, but you can't just allow things to happen. Number 7, confidence in actions. Trust and believe in the choices you make and the actions you take. He said, when you make a move, you have to believe in what you're doing. Number 8, commit to lifelong learning. Continuously seek new knowledge and skills while reinforcing your core principles. You have to continuously learn new techniques while always reinforcing the fundamentals. Number 9, face and overcome fear. Understand fear as a protective mechanism, but do not let it limit you. Fear is a normal emotion that protects you, but sometimes you don't need protection, he said. Number 10, balance mind, body, and spirit. Integrate physical, mental, and spiritual practices for holistic well-being and performance. He said, without a spiritual connection to both life and death, you can't reach the next level of performance.
Duncan, another fantastic top 10. As always, we can also learn from people's stories by identifying the behaviors to avoid on our own path to mastery. So what are your top 10 lessons to avoid from Rickson Gracie's story?
Number 1, avoid over-reliance on physical strength. Avoid depending only on brute strength. Focus on technique and strategy as well. He said he had to rely on leverage, sensitivity, and timing to compensate for his lack of strength. Number 2, avoid neglecting emotional preparation. Don't ignore the importance of being mentally and emotionally ready. I realized that if I could control my mind, I could improve every aspect of my performance. Number 3, avoid skipping rest and recovery. Ensure you balance intense activity with adequate rest to prevent burnout. He said, balance intense effort with sufficient rest to avoid burnout. Number 4, isolating yourself. Maintain connections with family and community. Isolation can lead to emotional issues. He said, after Hoxton's death, I realized how important my family was to my emotional recovery. Number 5, avoid letting ego drive decisions. Keep your ego in check to avoid making decisions that are not in your best interest. I learned that it was a mistake to fight emotionally because emotions blinded me. Number 6, avoid ignoring team dynamics. Be aware of and foster positive team dynamics for overall success. He said some teachers are only concerned with making great fighters and have no regard for the other positive aspects of martial arts. Number 7, avoid overlooking humility. Stay humble to continue learning and improving in all areas. Humility played a big role in my progress. Number 8, avoid improper breathing techniques. Understand and apply proper breathing methods for better performance. Not knowing how to breathe is like having a hand and not knowing how to use your fingers. Number 9, neglecting mental training. Training the mind is just as crucial as training your body for overall effectiveness. The mental part of the game is the most challenging, he said. And finally, number 10, avoiding emotional vulnerability. Be open about your emotions and don't suppress them, as it can lead to deeper issues. He said, I thought that it was important to be fragile and let myself feel whatever pain, doubt, loss, weakness, and emptiness I needed to feel. Thank you very much for joining myself and Greg on this episode. If you enjoyed what you heard, please take a moment to click like and to subscribe. And we ask you to take a moment out of your day to spread the word by sharing this with 2 people in your network. And for that, we'll be truly grateful. See you next time on Performers.